very warm welcome to the latest in our series of Quarantimes calls. Very happy today to have a wonderful speaker to help us think about what it means for the geopolitics, particularly of the Indo-Pacific. Our speaker today, Roger Mohan, is, I think, one of the most brilliant thinkers on strategic issues in India. I first met him when I was trying to understand the turn from Nehruvian Moralpolitik to a sort of much more realpolitically driven global role for India, and nobody explained it better than Roger Mohan. And he's done that as a journalist, as a think tanker at the Carnegie Endowment, and now he has a double role as a professor at the National University of Singapore and a columnist for the Indian Express. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Roger Mohan.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that generous introduction. So what I'll do is, and I'll try and focus on India's geopolitics, within which we cover the great power relations, as well as some of the developments taking place in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the post-COVID economic dynamic that is unfolding. So what I thought I'll highlight is 5 aspects of India's geopolitics, which I think are going through what began, as you said, 3 decades ago, when India changed its economic orientation to a far more complicated, more dynamic shift in India's geopolitics that is taking place. So the first of the 5 themes I want to highlight is the impact of rise of China. China's rise, as all of us would agree, that has been the single most important geopolitical event of our times. But I think India is too close, so it is not an abstract discussion for us. And what's happened in the last decade, I think at least dating back to 2008, the problems between India and China have steadily grown. And there is, in fact, I argue that there is a structural crisis today in the India-China relationship. What was an attempted normalization 3 decades ago today is breaking down amidst a number of factors. First, on the border, last night, we've had this first bloodshed on the border in 4.5 decades. Some Indian soldiers and some Chinese soldiers have lost their lives in this clash. So it tells you that it is just the 4th military crisis between India and China in the last 7 years. So this is occurring more frequently, and I think it is based on a profound change in the nature of Chinese military power, which has reached much closer to, in terms of the border, Indian border, the Indo-Tibetan border, what it used to be called, is now Sino-Indian border, which was contested but not militarized. But what we've seen happen in the last decade is it is now contested as well as militarized, and that has increased the frequency of the conflict between the 2 sides. And then we've not had a resolution of the boundary dispute. So I think we are put in a situation where the chances of a conflict are rising by the year. And as I said, we are in the 4th crisis. We had hoped that increasing economic cooperation would resolve some of these problems, but the economic cooperation itself has become a political dispute between India and China. India's trade deficit with China today is close to $60 billion. It's almost 40% of India's total trade deficit. So on the economic front, we have a problem. And more broadly, on the maritime side and on the Himalayas and the maritime side as well, the Chinese power projection into the Indian Ocean is beginning to create a new set of challenges for India. And I think India is beginning to respond to that. So we're going to have a lot more competition in the seas as well. And the problem for China, I think, is the Chinese see themselves today much stronger than India. Their GDP is 5 times bigger than India. Their GDP is around 14 trillion. India is around 3. So I think that gap, we see it all across Asia, whether it is Japan, India, Philippines, Indonesia. We always talk about the power gap between the power balance that has changed between America and China or Western China. But within Asia, the imbalance is dramatic today. That is, if you take the US out of the equation, the nature of the imbalance has grown, and I think much of Asia is struggling to deal with it. And that brings me to the second set of points, I mean, I think in the past, when India had problems with China, India turned to the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s to balance China. But today, Russia is much closer to China than it was ever before. And while it is still friendly to India, India can no longer rely on the Russians to do the balancing of China. So for the first time, I would say that India today is turning to the US in an unprecedented manner. While India-US relations have improved, the deepening crisis between India and China, and if India needs to balance that, the US has become a central part of any answer that we devise to the problem of China. And therefore, what we've seen happen under Mr. Modi in the last 6 years is a steady expansion of India-US security cooperation. India is part of the Quad, which is the plan for grouping that will eventually deal with the security of the Indo-Pacific, the signing of various so-called American agreements, the foundational agreements, greater intelligence sharing, more maritime cooperation. So no one would have bet on India-US getting so close on the defense side, but today we are close, and I think the Chinese power is forcing India to get closer to the United States. While India is today far more open to dealing with the US, of course, like all of you in Europe, we also worry about where the US is headed. While the defense side, you can see there is greater consistency, but the larger questions of the US trajectory are being debated in India as well. So the question comes up, does India put all its eggs in the American basket today to be able to deal with the China problem, or should it hedge? So there, I think in the past, we tended to hedge by looking to BRICS and China and Russia, and to retaining some of the old non-aligned kind of positions. But today, I think India is increasingly turning to the non-American West, assuming there's still something called the West. Hopefully, it'll stick around for a while. That India's expanding engagement with Europe, with Japan, with Australia is something, and Britain, of course, whether it's part of Europe or not, a renewed effort at rebuilding relationship with the Commonwealth. So we are seeing that while in India in the past, its distinct anti-colonial chip on the shoulder, which I see, there's an interesting debate in the West on this today, but I think India sees today having Europe, and if you will, the European colonial powers back into the East is a good thing. That is, if American retrenchment is inevitable, that having the European powers in a different form, Britain withdrew from east of Suez in 1968, the Europeans never came back after the 60s. But today, I think, given the growing stakes of Europe and Britain in the Indian Ocean and the East, we hope that Europe will come back to the East. Britain will try and regain some role, and that India is prepared to work with Europe in a manner that it has never done before. Because in the past, we used to think Europe, colonial powers, they have no business to be in the Indian Ocean. Today, we're actually actively courting the Europeans and the British to say, look, let's find new ways of working together, because if it is a question of balance of power, that any solution without the Americans would necessarily involve both whether you call the middle powers or getting the Europeans, the maritime coalition, whichever way you look at it, Europe will have to play a larger role, and Britain will hopefully return to the East, and then we have Japan, Australia, India working together to produce a reasonable coalition. We're not saying contain China, but we need to balance China. We need to limit the consequences of the imbalance that has emerged in Asia. The fourth set of issues I wanted to talk about is multilateralism. India, we used to be Mr. No, for a long time in various multilateral bodies. In climate change, less than a decade ago, India was a part of the problem. But under Mr. Modi, we are beginning to change. We have changed our positions on a lot of the multilateral issues, whether it is the climate change issue, where India is actively working with France to develop this coalition on Solar Alliance, We are working with, yesterday we've announced India is going to be part of the new alliance for AI with largely G7 plus Norway plus Australia plus other democracies joining together to develop artificial intelligence. It's going to be, the secretariat is going to be headquartered in OECD. So I think India is no longer afraid or hesitant or shy of sitting with Western coalitions to deal with the emerging challenges. So I think this is a fundamental shift in the way India is going to relate to the international system. And I think it's not just about being close to the Americans, but when it came to intra-Western issues, I think India has taken independent positions, for example, supporting France and other Europeans on climate change. So I think there is a lot more that we can do on multilateral issues. Finally, I want to say something about the economic development. I think here, the post-COVID, India is now looking at, our Prime Minister has announced a strategy which walks away from the hyper-globalisation of the last 4 decades. That of course, Mr. Modi is not saying we want to go back to era of self-sufficiency. Well, he uses the phrase self-reliance. What he's talking about was to reconfigure global supply chains, reconfigure the kind of collaboration that we do. If China has gamed the global economic system for unilateral advantage, the need to restructure the global economic system becomes important. As I said, for India, the principal problem on free trade has been the Chinese expansion into the Indian market. And today, that it is willing to work with the Quad and the Quad Plus countries to say, look, is there a way we can do things differently on WTO? Is there a way we can do things differently in WHO? Is there a differently we can do on economic cooperation that, as the saying goes in Washington these days, among friends, we trust each other. Can we rearrange the global economic order to reduce the excessive reliance on China and the costs that it has produced for the world as a whole? So these would broadly be the themes on which I think India's change is taking place. And I think in terms of the kind of resonance we've had extraordinary engagement with all the American administrations, including the Trump administration, starting with George Bush. We had Obama and now Trump. And we hope that even if Biden comes back, we still see the security economic partnership going. With Europe, the engagement is relatively new and long overdue. We hope today that France has become a major partner for India in the Indian Ocean, and we hope we can do more with other European countries. And Britain, of course, is whether we can do directly with Britain bilaterally or focus on Commonwealth, which has 50-odd countries. So I think there is the whole new possibilities of how we're going to work with Europe. And to the east, Australia, Japan, and even countries like Indonesia, which are today at the receiving end of the Chinese power assertion in the Indo-Pacific, are, I think, should be open for more substantive cooperation. So I think we are looking at a world in which if the structure is going to be rearranged, then I think India this time will be an important part of that, unlike in the past. So I would just conclude with one thought. We had two previous moments when India and the West seemed poised to work together, but they did not. 1946, 47, the end of the Cold War, because Indian political leadership did not support the West in the Second World War. While it was anti-fascist, did not support the Allies and withdrew from the political support. But the Indian army, the Indian people were fully mobilized to fight the Great War in Europe, the Second World War in Europe. So the Indian contribution did not translate into effective post-war collaboration between India and the West, and partly because of the colonial question and how the Cold War played out. So the tragedy that where India could have been a natural part of the post-war organization of the international order. And India's socialist policies limited what we could do with the West. There was a second moment in the 60s when a fleeting moment where India could change its socialist orientation, expand, relate to the global economy in a more positive way and to reconnect with the security institutions of the West, partly as Britain was withdrawing from the Indian Ocean, but I think that too did not come to pass. So we are at a third juncture where today a genuine long-term collaboration between India and the West seems at hand. And if we get things right, I think this would be definitely a huge marker for the world that if India working with the West.